for that welcome. It's lovely to be here. I think I should warn you that when I was first approached to speak today, I spent like a solid 2 or 3 weeks trying to convince Margaret that I would not be an appropriate speaker for your session. And I'm sure that some of you are going, this doesn't make any sense to me in this moment. I'm hoping that it will by the end. But I titled the discussion I want to have today, Retail and History, with a heavy emphasis on the question mark. What I was really hoping that we could discuss today is I love talking to people who aren't in the retail field on a day-to-day basis because your experience is so much different from mine. And I think that what is so wonderful about this idea of sharing our expertise is that really interesting things come out when people who have expertise in social media or preservation or fundraising or management or retail kind of collide. We always create something new. So I'm hoping that by the end of today, between your input and my initial thoughts on the matter, we're going to have a really interesting dialogue about what happens when these two areas collide, as they so often do in so many of our commercial districts. And I'm going to start by, I was really feeling self-conscious about, my disqualifications for doing this. So I'm going to give you just a brief overview of my pedigree. So, as was mentioned in my introduction, I was educated at the University of Virginia, where I was, without a doubt, going to become a preservationist. And I had resigned myself that I was going to be making a low income for my entire life, but that I was going to be doing God's work and saving historic properties, and that was okay. And I've always believed in working for the greater good, so that was no big deal. I had the great privilege of studying under Richard Guy Wilson and Mario Duval Marana, the second of whom I drove absolutely crazy. But I still learned a great deal from him in that process. And when I left the University of Virginia, I was hell-bent on going on in my graduate studies because you might be surprised to hear this. It's surprisingly hard to get a job with an undergraduate bachelor's degree in architectural history. So me and the French literature majors went on to graduate school, and I was on a path. I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I was going to go to Cornell University, and while I was going to switch my focus to urban planning, I was going to study under Michael Tomlin, who is a very well-known preservationist, at least up in the New York area, and he ran the preservation planning department. So continuing full speed ahead, the age of 22, knew exactly how everything was going to be mapped out in life. And for my graduate thesis, I wrote about Lenrock, which is Cornell spelled backwards, and was the home of Ezra Cornell as he was building the university. Isn't he a charming-looking man? But he had really good taste in architecture and built this absolutely amazing Gothic Revival house that, when I was studying it, was occupied by, and still is, a fraternity. And so where I had attended several parties and thought, it's very strange to me that you're allowed to live in this house. So I did a thesis about how you incorporate adaptive reuse into kind of a softer, gentler reuse strategy. I couldn't think of anything more dramatic than the founder of the university's house and a fraternity in order to illustrate that concept. But something happened to me at Cornell. Some say it's the water, some say it's the gorges. I took statistics. Now, for many of you, that was a point in your life when you wanted to die, probably, or at least went to a tutor or sought out some other kind of assistance. Statistics resonated with me. I completely got it. I struggled in every other form of math my entire life. But for some reason, how you look at numbers and look at their relationships and correlations to one another just resonated with me in a serious way. And so that's starting to creep into my head right around this time. And then we took a turn. So I graduate from Cornell and I go to Boston. And I'm employed by the Massachusetts Historical Commission as a Section 106 4F National Tax Credit Reviewer. And it was a very cool job, and I really liked it a lot, and I got to do lots of cool things. But one of the things that I was asked to do was I was doing the National Tax Credit Review on a project by the East Boston Community Development Corporation. And because it was in Boston, I had to co-review it with my Boston colleague. And it was this old high school. They were going through this horrible contraction throughout all the Boston schools. And East Boston just had a slew of these closed schools that they didn't know what to do with. And this one they were going to convert to senior housing, which they desperately needed. And by the time I got involved in the project, they had been undergoing tax credit review for 3 years. And my Boston colleague and I went out to the site. It was the first time I had seen the building. We were going through all of the questions about things that were still left untaken care of, and we had all these drawings with us. And they had their architect there, and they were showing us the things that they were planning to purchase for construction materials. And my Boston colleague, who had been working on the project forever, said, I was really clear. I told you that you couldn't use the quarter-inch mullions. You had to use the eighth. And he rejected the petition and sent them back for another 3 months of review. And in that moment, my entire preservation heart just disintegrated into like a little puddle, like in The Grinch. And I was so disheartened, and I looked at him, and I went back to my SHPO director, and I'm just like, is this really what we're doing? And that be told, I'm much older than I look. I'm very youthful looking, thank you. But, that was back in a time when we were really struggling from a preservation philosophy standpoint. We were still really in the beginning of the debate about whether or not we wanted to replicate or restore, if we wanted to be complementary or reproductive, not that way, but reproducing things. And we were really at a crossroads in a lot of different ways, and that really showed up in our state historic preservation offices, and especially in how we handled tax credit review. And I would love to one day sit down with somebody from the Maryland office to see if their experience is similar to the one that I had in Massachusetts. What ended up happening is I left that position pretty soon after that. And I was working for Senator Kerry's reelection campaign, reelection to the Senate, so you know how long ago that was. And I just decided that it was time to leave town. So I went to Chicago. Long story short, I ended up in Alexandria. I know, right? Okay. And I started working for this guy. This guy's name is Richard Heaps. He is considered the father of Newtown Center development because he is the designer of Meisner Park in Boca Raton, Florida, which looks much more in place contextually when you're there than it ever does in a photograph, because you clearly would not put this in Frederick. But it was revolutionary at the time because it was a development completely constructed with retail on the ground floor, office and residential above, and really provided a whole host of amenities that were really intended to replace what Boca Raton had lost when it basically demolished its downtown in the 60s. And the reason why this guy became influential, this was already built when I came on board in Alexandria, is he said to me, okay, so these have been operational for a while, and everybody started replicating them once Meisner Park came along. He said, we have tons of retail vacancy, though. Like, I don't know what's going on. Like, we can't fill retail space. Either people are not understanding the vision or there's something else going on. Go figure it out. And that's pretty much how you got studio direction for Richard. And so he sent me on a tour of new town centers basically around the country, which was really cool. And I started studying them. And somewhere in the back of my mind, the statistics thing just started ticking, like poking me. And I started realizing I just thought that I would be able to use a model or find something that somebody had created to evaluate retail markets in these new town center developments, but they hadn't. And so we were going to have to create it. And we started looking at what we were doing from a design perspective in these projects that were making it difficult for retail to be successful. And so then that brings us to today. So now I'm at StreetSense. I actually was recently named a partner. They clearly haven't updated the website. Thanks. Being a partner gets you lots of perks. And I work with 130 people there who are all dedicated to the idea that we're very pro mixed-use development or restoration or renovation of any kind, infill, whatever, but that our focus is coming at it from a retail perspective. So we might work with a residential architect or an office commercial architect, but that we understand that 20 feet and below level. And we understand it inside and out and backwards and forwards, and I understand it from a market perspective. So for the past 20 years, I've been a practicing retail market analyst with a secret preservation background. And in that capacity, I've worked with a lot of historic districts. I'm just going to go through a couple of them to talk about kind of how we interacted with them. The first one is Georgetown. And everybody's always kind of amazed that we got called in by Georgetown's bid, because if you thought anybody kind of had it all clicking on all cylinders, you would think it was Georgetown. And it's true that they are one of the more successful bids at incorporating retail and historic structures. There's lots of reasons for that. The biggest is that there are 40,000 cars that drive down that street on a daily basis, and the average household income of the people driving down those streets is $190,000 a year. So it's a captive audience because you're usually delayed for quite some time. And the storefronts act as, it's almost like ads in a magazine, if you think about it that way. Except nobody ever has time to read a magazine anymore, so while you're stuck in traffic, you're kind of browsing what's going on around you. The problem that they were having is that they had tenants that were paying $150 a square foot for rent at the corner of Wisconsin and M, which is 100% quarter in Georgetown. And every other landowner throughout the entire area thought that they should get $150 a square foot too. And so the bid brought us in to say, you have to explain this to them. They won't listen to us. And they're just holding out. And they were starting to have a vacancy problem because people weren't assigning reasonable rents. And so we did a comps analysis that basically said, if you are 300 feet from this corner, your rent should be this much lower. If you are in a historic structure that has not had utility improvement, your rent should be this much lower. If you have not had any kind of facade renovation, or if you have a deferred maintenance issue, it's this much lower, so that we gave them kind of a sliding scale to be able to communicate with the landowners to get kind of a better perspective on what was practical in the market. In Durham, North Carolina, we did an analysis of their downtown area, and when we were invited in to study it, they had a retail vacancy rate of 83%. Which meant that they had a retail occupancy rate of 17%, which if you drive through a city that only has maybe 1 out of every 2 storefronts filled out of every 10, you can understand why that was a burden, not just from a retail perspective, but from a residential perspective, from office attraction, and it's a gorgeous, gorgeous downtown. And so the first thing we did was a retail market analysis to figure out how much retail they could realistically support. And then we went to the next level. If you think of retail, what I do is essentially just one big supply and demand curve all day long, every day. And I'm looking at how much demand do we have for retail in this environment, and how much supply do we have, and what's the quality of that supply. And in Durham, we found that we had some real problems. And it had to do with the fact that a lot of their storefronts were historic storefronts from the early part of the 1900s. And that there were 2 problems. They were either known to not be up to code or modern retail expectations in terms of utilities and all the things that go along with that, or they were feared, which those were the worst. Because once a retailer signs on and gets in there and starts doing upgrades, if they uncover the sewer pipe that needs to be reconnected to the system, that's on them. And there was a story circulating around at the time about one of the boutiques that had come across a problem that cost them an extra $60,000 in their build-out. And it froze everybody in the market. And it was super unfortunate. This actually, if you're not familiar with Durham, there's a street in Durham. I'm having trouble remembering the name of it right now. It's not Magnum. It's Park, maybe. It's this one. And it's called Black Wall Street. And there was a time when you, as an African-American person in America, you could not borrow money, participate in a bank, put money in a bank, have a savings account or anything, but you could on this street in Durham. And they were all, it was just a series of banks owned by African-American bankers, and that's where you conducted your business. And I was going to be damned if we didn't figure out a solution for that. So we started looking at what are the things that we can do to take that element of risk out of the retailer's hands and take some of that on as part of the government. So they created this wonderful program that was a vanilla box grant program, where if there was a historic property that had some unknowns associated with it, that the landlord in conjunction with the city would bring it up to a vanilla box, which is a retail term for, it's kind of like this room. It's a room that has walls and a floor, and all the utilities are hooked up to it, and the lights are ready to be turned on. All you have to do is come in and put on the shelves and plug in your cash register, and you're good to go. That's vanilla box condition. You don't have to do anything to it. And that program has been tremendously successful. We geared it towards the market analysis so that they were trying to attract tenants for which there was demand, so that they weren't spending money on something that wasn't going to be sustained. And I kind of love the Durham example. But one of the things that really became important in Durham was this idea that we had to set priorities. That there were areas in Durham where the preservation of the historic properties was number one with a bullet. And that was things like the Black Wall Street area, the Five Corners area. There's a whole bunch of little areas that you would never want to see in any way besmirched because they tell such an amazing story through just being there. But there were other areas where we could make some choices. And so the ability to say, we will take this opportunity here to prioritize history, but in this area we're prioritizing commercial opportunity. And if that means that we have to widen some storefronts to increase transparency, if that means that we're going to allow some different paint than we would in another historic part of town, we're going to be willing to have that conversation in order to make the retail viable at those sites. University of Pennsylvania, this had a lot to do with the conversion of interior space so that it could be appropriate for retailers to locate in. So if you're familiar with the University of Pennsylvania, it's completely surrounded by West Philly, basically. And the university owns, this I didn't know before I started working for them, the university owns all of the land that surrounds their gate. And that constituted 300,000 square feet of retail space. And so they were trying to manage that retail space while also manage their on-campus dining and retail. And something that they kept running into time and time again was that they had the capacity to attract national tenants, but they had a very hard time fitting them into the spaces that were available around the edge of the campus. And I'm going to explain to you why that would be true in a moment. I'm sure that you all run into this problem as well. The ADA compliance issues were like mind-boggling and required the finest minds at Penn's architecture department to figure out. So I came home last night at 11:30 just to hang out with you all from Fredericksburg, which is where I have one of my active projects right now. If you've not been down to Fredericksburg to go have a custard at Carl's, I strongly recommend that it is worth the 2-hour drive. And you should be prepared to wait because there's always a line. It's kind of the Georgetown cupcake of Fredericksburg. And what we're dealing with down there is that we have a little bit of a disparity going on in that we have a community that really wants a vibrant retail downtown, but they don't want to allow any density in the area. And they're in the middle of this outrageous court battle right now that I will try to explain to you if I understand it correctly. Their ARB approved a townhouse development. The city council revoked the approval. The ARB is now suing the city council, who is being sued by the developer. It's kind of like one of those like action movies where it's like guns crossed, and everybody's got somebody. But part of the discussions that we've been having with them is that they're very concerned about the impact of density on their historic properties. And this particular townhouse development is right next to one of the only homes, I'm gonna get this wrong, one of the only homes known in America to have been visited by both George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, except the White House. Oh, except there wasn't there. Yeah, okay, I'm going back to my original premise. The only home visited by both George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. And they were telling me this, and like, this is where my preservation heart is dead. I turned to them and said, "Are they coming back?" Um, because I need people downtown in order to support retail. So it's great to have all these retail storefronts. They're beautiful and historic, but I can't fill them with active businesses because we aren't allowing more people to live in this environment. And we're traveling by car instead of horse and all of those other things that mean that we have to make adaptations for the current environment. Okay, so now I'm going to show you some of my tricks about how I'm looking at your historic spaces. And I just want you to take a different perspective back to your communities, or the next time you go shopping in a historic district and be like, oh, that's what's going on there. Okay, you can't see this very well. Is that okay? Okay. So this is an actual floor plan for a retail listing. And as you can see, it has this beautiful bowed front window, and you enter on the side, and you walk into this space. And there's a little office, which retailers always are very appreciative of. I think that's a bathroom. It kind of looks like a urinal. Maybe it could be a utility sink. I'm not sure. And then there's these pretty windows at the back that you hope don't look over the alley. If I'm looking at this as a retailer, this is all the things that are wrong with this space. It's too narrow. It's way too narrow. What that means is that my back of house is going to take up half of my space. I need places for my inventory. If I'm an apparel store, I need places for my dressing room. I certainly can't put a restaurant in here. I have absolutely no room for a kitchen. It would be very hard to even do like a small ice cream shop. It's too wide in some places and too narrow in others. So from top to bottom, the width is going to be, it's too wide for me to make sense of, and it's too narrow in the middle for my prototype to fit in. The only place where I have flat storefront is about 8 feet wide, and I need that to be about 20 feet wide. It's because that is my point of maximum visibility to passing traffic. I need to appeal to both traffic and pedestrians and bicyclists and people who are across the street. And that's kind of where I'm willing to pay all my money, is in that flat storefront area. This doesn't work for me at all. When you walk into my store, you need to be in the middle of it. I want you to be immersed in it right away. And what this little foyer does is it allows you to walk into my store, peek around the corner, get a little glimpse, and then turn around and walk out. Probably even before my sales clerk has seen you, so that you don't feel the shame of being compelled to come in and look around because you peeked in the door, which is absolutely part of the psychology of shopping. And what's difficult about this is that you're actually creating two thresholds. And in retail, getting somebody to cross the threshold is everything. So I'm asking you to cross the threshold at the door and then again at the entrance into the boutique or whatever I'm doing here. Then we have two areas where I don't know what to do. My cash wrap, or area where I would put my cash register, I want it to be as close as possible to the point of entrance and exit so I can kind of keep an eye on things, and you're not going to take your bag and pick something up on your way out the door. If I put it here, that makes my sales space so narrow between this stair and that other wall. And I have no idea how I'm getting out the back, which means all of my trash and deliveries are going out the front. This is what happens in this situation where the retailer goes through and kind of does this punch list in their mind of all the things that are complicated about this. And this is what ends up happening. Out in the suburbs, they build these beautiful spaces that answer all of my needs, and I don't have to think twice about it's the right width, it's the right depth, the narrow side faces the street, there's a way out the back for me to take my trash and loading, there's direct access from the front that puts you right in the middle of my store when you walk in the door. It's got all the things that I'm looking for except character. What you need to know about that is that character only gets you so far. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But if you ever have been frustrated with a commercial broker who you feel is not giving any attention to your awesome little historic storefront that would clearly be the perfect spot for a cafe, this is why. Because they get paid on commission, they do not get paid salaried ever, almost ever, and they can lease 100 spaces like this in the same amount of time it's going to take to rent your one space downtown, and to be able to find the tenant that will overlook all of those deficiencies to make that locational choice. So I apologize for all the brokers, but I can't be responsible for all the things that they do. I want you to be aware of this too. This is a big issue that we face all over the place. I seem to hit it in Virginia quite a lot, so I have a feeling it's a Maryland thing too. This is Newberry Street. Newberry Street's the place that breaks every retail rule that there ever was. And so whenever anybody says to me, well, they can do that on Newberry Street, I'm like, okay, are you bringing in 30 million visitors a year? And is the average household income around your very dense residential neighborhood upwards of $200,000? Well, then we have a different conversation to have. In retail brokerage, the general rule of thumb is for every step I have to take to get into a retail establishment, I am deducting 15% from my sales expectations. So, step. It's very conscientious to them. I used to think this was a myth, except that we have now had 7 different retailers from different parts of the country tell us the exact same thing, and it's how they're doing their sales profiling. It goes for up and down. So just be thinking about that whenever you're dealing with retail stoops, despite the fact that you have an ADA compliance issue as well. Just another piece of information to think about, how people design their storefronts. It's kind of like picking out your clothes a little bit. If you're a retailer, you want it to be very expressive, you want it to be very reflective of you. It's very difficult for retailers to get excited about design guidelines in a historic district in particular. And there's a really good business reason why a retailer needs to do that. If I'm passing a storefront walking, I can process about 3 feet every second. So I get time. I can look, I can see the merchandise, I can see what the store hours are. I have a whole process as I'm walking past it. If I'm a biker, I'm going by faster, I process it at 22 feet a second. So I might know you're there. If I'm driving, I have much less time to understand that there's a store there that I might be interested in. And what that does is, if you're ever in an area where they have all the same awnings and they require all of the tenants to have the same like channel lettering or something, quiz yourself or quiz the person with you. I like to do this. Like, I like to look at it and be like, there's a pho shop in there. I'm like, okay, and tell me what's in that shopping center. And the person with me is like, I have no idea what was in that. Was it green? I don't know. Was there a Starbucks? And it's like, no, you need to let your retailers be expressive on their storefronts. And I'm going to show you some of my extreme examples of storefronts in historic districts. And of course, they're all from Europe and Asia. So these are just a couple. I love the idea of going into a historic commission meetings being like, yeah, I want to paint my storefront completely black. There is no way that is compliant with the signage code there, but it's historic, right? One day, that will meet criteria D. Anyway, that's a joke that plays only in this room. Okay, so on this kind of platform of things, with my mother saying, where is all of this going? I thought you were going to be a preservationist, and now you're a retail market analyst. I'm like, I swear to God, it's coming together someday. I just don't know how. And the answer was it came together on the Vibrant Streets project. This is a project that we were commissioned to do by the DC government, which we actually turned into a national program in 2013. And essentially what the district came to us to say was, we have all of these small neighborhoods. Almost all of them are historic. Almost all of them are asking us to do small area plans. And we don't have the resources to do small area plans for all these different neighborhoods. So we want to create a toolkit that allows people to evaluate their retail potential without us having to hire on a consultant to go and do it. It's kind of a do-it-yourself kit. And it was daunting, and it was cool, and we had the best time doing it, and we still love the program tremendously. But the way that we did it was we looked at 19 different neighborhoods that we all agreed were great, ideal retail streets. And we did them in 2 different categories. This is our small-scale shopping streets category. You will see that Frederick is on this list, which is how Kara Norman and I became besties. And then we also did destination streets, and those were more global. but those were places that people went to specifically for the experience of shopping and being on the street. And what started to happen when we were doing this analysis is that we found that we measured everything you can possibly think of on those 19 streets, like ridiculous, crazy things, like it was like, how wide's the sidewalk? What's the distance between the light poles? What's the average household income in a quarter mile? What is it in 3 miles? What's the average household spending on things like cat food in a half mile? Like, we were trying everything to see what correlated, and 8 things correlated across the board. And there are these 8 things. And this became the framework for the Vibrant Streets Toolkit. The idea was that you needed to be able to move through this process in order to create the foundations to have a healthy retail street, because we kept dealing with these neighborhoods that they had this notion that if they just put in beautiful streetscape, that the retail would occupy their spaces, that they would get better retail. And what was happening is, yes, they had a beautiful streetscape, but they had a ton of crime, and they did not have retail appropriate store spaces. And oh, by the way, nobody was managing what was going on the street through a business association or a bid or anything, or Main Street Association. And so they had a beautiful streetscape with vacant stores. And so we started getting into this process. And here's my other moment of enlightenment. East Boston was one moment. This is what brought me back. So you know when the Grinch's heart grows like really big? That's about to happen. This happened. The final step in our process was after you determined that you had the market in place and that you could secure it and that you had people in charge of it that were doing good things and you were connecting to the neighborhood, were you unified? Here's what being unified meant. Is your retail district located in a historic district? Was the number one criteria for being unified, because when we looked at these streets across the board, the ones that resonated with us, that were memorable to us, that had a unified character to them, almost singularly were located in a historic district. And so while for 20 years we had been looking at historic districts as like the bugaboo, like you've got to be kidding me, you're not going to go into a historic property, are you? Do you know what you're going to uncover when you get there? We found this out and realized that being in that environment has so many intangible benefits in terms of customer attraction. You can't imagine how many, oh, well, you can because you're all Marylanders, but how many people do you know that say, I don't know what we're going to find there, but it's Saturday night, let's go to Frederick and see what's going on. They're not going to go to a particular restaurant or a particular store. They're going to come have that experience, which means that your customer base is so much broader and so much easier to engage. And so, bigger heart. Okay. With that in mind, I wanted to go through a couple of points just to talk to you for 1 second about how retailers make site selection decisions. Am I okay on time? Okay. So I tried to pick things that people would like to have in their close by commercial districts whenever possible. And we actually did this as part of our work with the DC government in their neighborhoods, because all the time we would deal with these people that were like, we spend a ton of money on home goods, and we're wealthy, and we're good local patronage people. We should have a Williams-Sonoma on our street. Now go get us one of those. And the failure of people to bring Williams-Sonoma to them was clearly a failure of the economic development department or the brokerage community or whatever. And it became my responsibility to come in and say no, and here's why. And so we started creating these charts, and we just thought they were stupid. And then everybody was like, oh my God, I totally get it now. And I realized that we think this way in the brokerage community, but it's not necessarily a typical way to think about it, because we all participate in the retail environment as customers. So we feel like we inherently understand it. This is how it works from a retailer's perspective. This was a regional home decor store looking at 3 neighborhoods in DC. And what I wanted to emphasize was any retailer that has to go through a lending process at any point in time needs to have something like this. And it's super systematic, and it's like bulletproof to them almost. Is the population at a significant enough density in 3 miles to support our store? Neighborhood number 3 didn't meet the threshold. It's out. I don't care if it's the most beautiful, historic, up and coming, the people there are super nice and give 20% to charity. I don't care. There's not a petition in the world that's going to convince me to look at neighborhood 3 after they failed my first level test. Average household income, $50,000 within 3 miles. Everybody gets to go ahead to the next step. Where we start to have trouble is one of these is a very competitive environment for home decor, and one of them is not. And they wanted to be someplace where they could command the market. So they advanced here. That's the last part is sometimes the very hardest part, which is after you've gone through all of that, you still have to find a site that's appropriate for them. The joke that I like to tell is that we did like 6 of these for the DC Office of Planning, and for 3 of them, we determined no appropriate site was found. And they told us we had to take that out because it was too negative. So all of our diagrams have a site found, but in reality, about half of them aren't going to be able to locate a site that meets their requirements. As I was working on this for you, I was thinking about how I talk to people about nail salons and tell them that this is why there are nail salons everywhere. They have the lowest barrier to entry of any retail type, so they'll go anywhere. I was thinking that not the really good antique stores, but kind of the crappy antique stores are sort of like the nail salons of historic districts. And then for a regional grocery store, I always like to show this one just because this really happened. This is exactly how it happened. They're looking at 3 neighborhoods. Number 3 is on the border because it didn't quite make the income, but it's close enough that they're going to look at them for the next level. These others, that one gets knocked out for traffic count, and then we get down to incentives. And the first one doesn't have an incentive package, but the neighborhood 3 does. We have a really good grocery incentive package in DC, and so they signed here. And what I always try to emphasize in this context is everybody wants to throw incentives at retailers. Like that's always their solution to getting retailers to come to an environment. But this grocer never would have signed a lease at this location if they hadn't been able to fulfill their baseline requirements 1 through 3. More than that, they wouldn't have been successful there if they hadn't been able to meet those market standards too. So incentives factor in, but they never factor in first. And then I just wanted to summarize with a couple of thoughts, because I thought this was a rare opportunity, and if you didn't invite me back ever, I wanted to make sure you knew these things. So a historic district with a retail component is something that you need to know how to sell to the retail world. And when I say retail, I mean restaurants, I mean stores, I mean grocery stores, all of it. What you have with that historic district that will never be replicated in the suburbs is your point of market distinction. And that's what you need to sell. Don't try to compete with the suburbs head-to-head. I've just told you a million reasons why you can't. But you can offer something that people feel, and that's what you need to sell. I already gave you that bad news. So suburbs will already be simpler. One of the things that happens in a retail market is that if you have a very high household income and a very high density, you're never going to have trouble attracting retail because they will take whatever garbage space you want to give them to be part of that market. If you are in a more disadvantaged area, it's much, much harder. And there are ways to overcome that, but you have to be crafty. And you have to think a little bit like Durham. Like, what's the problem at hand here? What's the root of it, why we're not getting people here? Is it because we don't have enough money? Is it because our rents are too high? Is it because we need to build out the space so that they can see the potential? Retailers, by the way, are like super not creative, and they don't like to take risks at all. Those are 2 secrets that they would not want me to tell you. But they cannot look at a space and be like, oh, I see it. I totally get it. That never works. We have to do Photoshop renderings for them constantly. And they want basically a written guarantee that they're going to do $1,000 a square foot for the next 10 years when they're going to sign a lease. So you just have to, be aware that that's who you're dealing with in a lot of these situations. And my parents are retailers, so I can say those things. But why I'm putting all these things up here, and I want you to just be really aware of them when you go back and look at your own situations, is that whenever you're dealing with this type of situation, know your negotiating position. So are you in a strong negotiating position? You can ask for a lot of things for that retailer because they really want to be there. Or are you in a weak negotiating position, and you might need to be willing to bring some things to the table in order to make that more interesting. I'm incredibly grateful to you all for restoring my preservation heart just by asking me to be here, so I had to think about it again. Get back in touch with my roots. I feel like healing has happened. And I would be happy to answer any questions. Margaret's texting and not looking at me, so I'm not really sure if I'm supposed to answer questions. Sweet. Thanks. Oh, yes, vibrantstreets.com. Feel free to peruse it. There's plenty of free things, and, of course, the National Toolkit is available for sale. I'll sign it for you. But if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Yes?
A lot of discussion, especially in national retailers, about consistent hours.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How big do you find that issue for national retailers?
So I'm not sure why you're asking about it for national retailers. Is it because they want to know that people have consistent hours? Okay. So this is actually a super complicated question because especially in smaller districts, you get people who are in it at all different levels. And the hobbyist retailers are always the most difficult ones to deal with in this situation. I often associate them with the spouse of the really well-to-do person who doesn't have anything to do with their time, so they open a store. We've handled that a couple of different ways, and in Manassas, we've had some experience with bribery. That seems to have worked really, really well, where we put out a grant that would give people access to a point-of-service cash register, which is kind of like a fancier way of doing your cash registers. It's almost like now it's a square. This was literally like 5 years ago, and the technology is already way past it. But that in exchange for participating in the point of service grant program, you were going to agree to a set number of consistent hours. You could deviate from them higher or lower. You could open earlier or stay open later, but that you were agreeing to a core. The real reason that we did it was because by controlling the point of service computer, we could collect their sales information and figure out how to distill that to attract more retailers. But we made the hours contingent upon that. And one of the outcomes of that was that we weren't running into the situation that happens all the time, where somebody's like, oh, I want to come down to downtown Frederick. Let's go see what's happening on Saturday night. And we get down here and we see the awesome glass store that closed at 4:30. That creates repeat customers are everything in retail. And when that happens, you just lose, not only for that store, but really everyone around you. So we try the carrot as much as possible. I wouldn't be above the stick. It's really important. It's super important. And if you want to have them call me, I'll tell them what's what. Poor Kara. Yep. Yep. So it's a great question, and she was saying that she lives near a historic Main Street. She lives near a historic Main Street, and there's one landowner that owns a lot of the property. And is that a good thing or a bad thing? And it, like you pointed out, it completely depends on whether or not they're a good or a bad landlord. I actually think it makes it much easier because when we talk about the managed step in Vibrant Streets, there's two ways to become managed. The first is to form an organization to manage the retail environment. The other way is to have a single owner. So I don't know how many of you have been to or visited Bethesda Row. Bethesda Row is kind of the national example that everybody holds up of something that never would have happened if it hadn't been for single ownership, because it never would have been able to be pulled together at the level that it was. That said, you have to have a motivated single owner, and there's lots of different ways to do that. I like to find one particular store that I think has a lot of potential and put all of our resources into it. That basically becomes the beacon for everyone else to get jealous and try to emulate. Because nothing breeds a desire to do better than competition in a retail environment, especially when they see somebody making more money. So there's all kinds of different ways to deal with it. I actually think it's a huge opportunity. You had a question here, right?
Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, many national chains such as Walmart, Wawa,
Yeah,
started building superstores.
yeah,
Which means they all moved out of downtown.
right.
Have any of the retailers, such as those, thought about going back to a downtown model?
Mhm.
Because when they do that, everyone has to get in their car and drive.
Yeah.
To get to the store.
Right. So, in theory, it always sounds like a really good idea. There's two major problems with it. The first one is that these historic downtowns are usually really difficult to access. Frederick is kind of that's an outlier in that respect. So the thing that the national chains are always really concerned about is that they won't be able to receive their goods in a timely fashion. And one of the things that I learned about the price of goods is that your ability to get them quickly and easily is everything, because they will charge you more. So we're working on a huge project in Flint, Michigan, where the big frustration is that in the poorest neighborhood that has been affected most by the water crisis, they're charging $5 for a jar of peanut butter, when peanut butter is one of the things listed on the CDC preferred diet list for treating children with lead poisoning. And they're like, are you kidding me? Well, it's so hard to get to that store that gets such a small shipment that they don't have a choice but to charge more, and they have the same profit margin as somebody that's charging much less. So they hate that. That's one of their big bugaboos right off the bat. The other problem that we're going to see probably for the next 10 years at least is that Walmart created the neighborhood grocery store. I don't know if y'all remember that there's like a brief moment in time where they opened like 100 neighborhood grocery stores around the country. And at the same time, they were put in a position where they were fortunately forced to raise wages, and they were dealing with all of this pressure from their shareholders because they were showing reduced profitability, and they closed them all down. And what ended up happening, and in some ways I guess I should write them a thank you note, but I don't like getting work this way, is that they put a bunch of grocery stores out of business within 6 months, and then they left town. So we now have all of these underserved neighborhoods across the country that are doing like 45 minutes to 2 hours to get groceries. So that put a terrible stink on the whole concept. It wasn't even the concept's fault. It was really Walmart's fault. But I hope that we do see something like that come to fruition someday. It's going to come down to these silly little things, like how do we get things distributed faster? Maybe drones will save us all. Yes?
So one thing I hear over and over again about retail and historic districts is the limitations in terms of parking.
Ah.
I was wondering how that factors in you guys.
Mm-hmm. It completely depends. So in areas where we're successful with the density push, it's not such a big deal because we can really rely on the neighborhood customer base there. In other areas where it's the biggest issue, I'm guessing, you can tell me if I'm on the wrong track here, is that the easiest type of retail to put in a historic district is a restaurant. So food and beverage is the easiest thing to put in there. And they have peak times of occupancy, and they almost always conflict with the surrounding residents. So everybody's fighting for the same parking. When that starts to happen, you get this kind of parking stink about you. You also get people that aren't willing to walk 4 blocks when if they realize that when they park at Walmart, they are walking 4 blocks to get in the front door. Then, you start to change the narrative a little bit. So I actually had a chance to work with a main street in Pennsylvania where they did exactly that. They went around and counted parking spaces, and then they measured the distance from like a medium range parking space at Walmart to the front door of Walmart to give people a little bit better perspective on what they were being asked to do. And I just thought that was really fascinating. It doesn't mean that we're going to make everybody, super. If I'm going out to dinner and I have heels on, I don't want to walk either, but hopefully you get dropped off, right? Like, I think this is all about chivalry and perception. Yes. Uh-huh. Well, that's a $50,000 question. Literally, it costs about that much to do the analysis. But when we did the Vibrant Streets Toolkit, that was maybe the hardest part to do because we had to be able to communicate to people. You know, they were going out after retailers. Like, they would call them up on the phone and be like, I think you should be in my neighborhood, Trader Joe's. And they were like, okay, click. But what we did was try to give them a sense of how to measure their market from ways that were really tangible, like their vacancy rate, or were there a lot of architecture offices and storefronts in your downtown. Like, those things are indicators of the market that we could share. So what we were trying to do with the toolkit was say to people, okay, you don't have $50,000 to spend on us, but here's how you figure out if you're kind of a strong neighborhood goods market, or if you're a strong restaurant market, or if you're a strong boutique market. So that's one way. The other way to think about it is that if you are in a pretty competitive retail market, but you have a decent continuity of retail, almost any neighborhood can support neighborhood goods and services. So it's a dry cleaner, it might be a small produce opportunity, it's a hair salon, it might be a drugstore. But one of my favorite slideshows, which I'll just come back and do a whole conference if you want me to, because I would love that. One of my favorite slideshows is Vibrant Streets with just one retailer on them. And one really good retailer. And one of the examples is a barbecue shop, and the other example, it's a dry cleaner. One place where people cross and have interaction, whether they're employees or residents or visitors or high school students. I firmly believe in the power of retail to start to create that web of community, and I think it can happen in one dry cleaning store. So I always tell people to aim smaller than they think they should, because in retail, less is definitely more, because the last thing you want to do is distribute expenditures over too many people, and then nobody makes any money and everyone goes out of business. So aim for less, but make them awesome, and you know, if you land on $50,000, give me a call. Yes. I'm coming to you next because you've raised your hand like so many times. I'm so sorry. Yes.
You have a successful Main Street in the historic district. How do you draw the traffic around to the side streets and possible parallel streets? Still within the district, but they don't seem to go through traffic.
Okay, so something I didn't say, but you should definitely know about me, is that I'm super aware of my limitations. I know everything about retail. I know zippy-doo-dah about transportation and parking. I know like just enough to be colloquial, and that's it. So I would love to give you an answer, but I think it would probably be totally wrong. And that's probably better left to a professional. But I can tell you my personal opinion afterwards if you'd like to hear it. Now you. Mm-hmm. Right. Yep. So there's not a catch-all answer to that. I firmly believe that in areas that are successful, a mix of national and local is really great because the national drives the foot traffic. So locals that wouldn't, it's almost like having like an opening act that nobody's heard of for Taylor Swift. Like they're getting exposure that they would not get otherwise. But you know, there are certainly circumstances where the nationals are able to benefit on what the locals have built. And that always really upsets me when a local has struggled through a location for 30 years and then, you know, Bath and Body Works comes in and they're like out of business. So one of the things that we've been working on quite a bit is this idea of, you know, we have affordable housing programs. Where's our affordable retail program? And very much trying to think of how do you almost ensure that kind of a mix on a street where so much investment has been undertaken. But I never shy away from nationals coming into an environment because they're so important from a customer draw perspective. We used to work with a lot of locals that would wait to see where a Starbucks was going in order to make their site selection decision. They didn't actually do any of the numbers that I talked about. They just knew that Starbucks had. So if they had vetted a neighborhood, it was good enough for them too.
Maybe one last question.
Okay.
To what extent do retailers care about upper story occupancy? Is that an issue
Oh, that's interesting. So do you mean like if there's a resident or an office upstairs? Uh-huh. Okay, so they prefer office. Unless you are a law office in DuPont Circle and you're a burger shop downstairs and the law office sues you because of the smell, which has happened. They don't like residential as much because they complain more. But we always try to explain to the property owners, like, you need to do full disclosure on all of these things before you do that. The retailer doesn't especially care about what's upstairs. The one thing that I know for sure is that they don't want to be upstairs. So, anybody that's thinking of ways that they're going to do two-story retail, I'm going to really strongly advise you not to. And again, we can talk about that later, but that's a great question. Thank you. You guys were great. Thank you so much.